Sign on here. And good to see so many familiar faces and names on the screen. We'll get started here in just a minute. Welcome, everybody. Good evening to those of you on the East Coast. Good afternoon to those of you on the West Coast. It's good to have everyone with us, and I want to thank everyone for being here with us. It's our monthly leadership session. For those who haven't joined them before, we've been doing them for about a year and a half now, and it's a great opportunity to do continuing education for Hasbara Fellows and to bring together our Hasbara Fellows on college campuses across the US and Canada, bring all of you together, as well as our high school interns, Hasbara High School interns, our alumni network, and of course our donor and supporter network who make our work possible. So thank you all for joining us and for being here. Before we get started, before we introduce our guest speaker, I just want to mention a couple of things. So this time of year, for in our line of work, we're working on college campuses and for our students, is sort of a tougher time of year. At the end of the spring semester is when we see so much of the negativity facing Jewish students and pro-Israel students on college campuses. It's at this time of year that we have Israel Apartheid Week, and unfortunately the resolutions to boycott Israel on college campuses that we see pop up every year, and it's at this time that things kind of heat up, and we have Hasbara Fellows that are on too many campuses now. They're a little too long to list, who are going through sort of the toughest times right now. And I just want to thank the Hasbara Fellows for all you do, for being active, for taking the time to stand up. You don't have to. There are many who choose to kind of close their eyes and ignore what's going on, and not the people on this call. And so I want to really thank you. And I want to specifically just mention our students on a couple of campuses, and first one being the University of Indiana, where unfortunately we've seen over the last couple of weeks, things really crossed the line, where there's been apparently an organized effort to rip mezuzahs off of dorm rooms of Jewish students at Indiana. And we've seen swastikas pop up in the town of Bloomington, where the college is. And we've been warning for a long time that anti-Israel propaganda could easily cross the line into anti-Semitism, outright anti-Semitism, and it's clearly happened now many times. And in the last couple of weeks, it's been happening at Indiana. So we just want to tell all the students there in Bloomington that we're thinking of you and you're not alone. And I also want to just mention briefly our friends at DePaul and at API, the fraternity, Jewish fraternity, where a brother this past, an API brother, and API being the Jewish fraternity with over 100 chapters around the country. One of their brothers was assaulted at a pro-Palestinian rally in New York City last week. He went with an Israeli flag to counter the message of the protest, and was assaulted and was ended up with bruising and had to seek medical attention. And so clearly what we've always used to think of as political speech, as anti-Israel propaganda, has clearly crossed the line again into violent anti-Semitism, violence and intimidation. And it's something that we're here to fight against. And it's not acceptable. We wanted to mention just the students that are on the campuses that are going through that now. And on a better note, though, I do also just want to mention briefly our students at Princeton University who defeated a BDS resolution last week at Princeton. And thank you for doing what you did, and thank you for reminding us that it's possible to fight back. And it's an inspiration to see students do that every day. And so thank you for all you've done for our students at Princeton. With that, I want to get into our topic today. And the mission of Hasbara Fellowships is to empower pro-Israel and Jewish student leaders to fight anti-Semitism and fight anti-Israel propaganda on their campuses. And while so much of that work is done through sound bites, we're used to doing this online and through tweets and sort of very, very brief type of dialogue most of the time. We very much believe in education, and we want our Hasbara fellows and students around the country to know their stuff and be well educated on all the issues related to our mission, related to anti-Semitism, related to pro-Israel activism. And that's the reason we organize trips to Israel. It's the reason we do these sessions every month. And so today's topic is about Hamas and Gaza and Israel's last war with Hamas. And we have a great speaker, Jonathan Schanzer. Dr. Schanzer, thank you for joining us. And I want to hand it off to Dorit, who's going to introduce him. Dorit is a board member of Students Supporting Israel at the University of Calgary and VP of Hillel there and a Hasbara Fellow. She was with us last August in Israel on Hasbara Fellowships. So Dorit, please go ahead. And if your mic isn't on, please come on stage and introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, that trip is amazing. If anyone hasn't gone, please go. So Dr. Jonathan Schanzer is Senior Vice President for Research at FDD, where he oversees the work of the organization's experts and scholars. He's also on the leadership team of FDD's Center on Economic and Financial Power, which is a project on the use of financial and economic power as a tool of statecraft. Jonathan's previously worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where he played an integral role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. He has held the previous think tank research positions at the Washington Institution for Near East Policy and the Middle East Forum. Jonathan has written hundreds of articles on the Middle East, along with more than a dozen monographs and chapters for edited volumes. His new book, Gaza, Conflict 2021, Hamas, Israel, and 11 Days of War, challenges and corrects some of the widely inaccurate news reported during the conflict. It is the first book published on the war. And Jonathan also testifies often before Congress and publishes widely in the American and international media. He has appeared on American television channels such as Fox News and CNN, and Arabic language television channels such as Al Arabiya and Al Jazeera. So I'd like to introduce Jonathan.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you guys.
Thank you, Dorit, and thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Dr. Schanzer, for joining us here. And you know, Jonathan, I've learned a lot from you over the years, and it's great to have you here and have you speaking to our Hasbara fellows. And some people may know, Jonathan, you were my first boss ever, actually, about 15 years ago. And at the time, you wrote, I believe, your first book on Gaza in 2008 or so. And you know, one thing that I want to kick off with, and I have a list of about 15 questions. I don't know how many we'll get to in an hour here. And we will do Q&A as well at the end. But it's, you know, you kind of have so much to say with the different dynamics happening in the Middle East. And you know, on campuses, we so often are sort of, we fall into this paradigm of Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's sort of simplified. And certainly when our students are speaking to people and are active against the BDS movement, and so, you know, they like to portray Israel as Goliath and the Palestinians as David. And your book sort of helps us understand that things are more complicated. There's a lot going on in the Middle East, and it's not just Israel and the Palestinians. So hoping you could talk to us a little bit about some of the key takeaways and what's really happening in the region.
Sure. Well, first of all, great to see you again. Can't wait to see you in person, and really look forward to being in in-person events with all of you on campus in Israel or wherever else we might meet. But for now, great to do it over Zoom. Alan, you're one of my favorite former employees. I love that you're still in this business. It's great. Makes me very happy. So a couple things to note about these conflicts. The first thing is that they have very predictable characteristics. And I won't get into all of them, but I'll just say this, that it starts with usually a rocket that's fired into Jerusalem by Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or perhaps even a group you've never heard of. Maybe it's into the Tel Aviv area. maybe it's the kidnapping of a soldier, but there's something that usually crosses the line, and that the Israelis feel compelled to respond. Now, the moment that I say they feel compelled to respond, I need to explain that Israel, throughout the course of any given year, will usually absorb rockets fired at them on a regular basis by Hamas, and they don't respond. Why? Because Israel they don't want to go to war in the Gaza Strip. There is nothing that Israel wants in the Gaza Strip. Just to be clear, they left the Gaza Strip in 2005. They decided that they didn't want to go back. And ever since then, Hamas has provoked them. Why? Because Hamas wants to look like they are defending the Palestinian cause, and they don't care what happens to the people of the Gaza Strip. But the way that it works is, and here comes the cycle, right? They fire into Israel, into a sensitive area. They fire on Israel's capital or into a major population center. Israel then responds. The way that they respond is also important to note. They don't just fire into the Gaza Strip with, the hope of killing as many Palestinians as possible. That's never how the IDF operates. What they have heading into every conflict is what we call a target bank. There are targets that they've identified inside the Gaza Strip that are identified with Hamas. So that's rocket stores, it's rocket making facilities, it's bunkers that are being used by Hamas, it's tunnels that are being used by Hamas. But they have identified these months, sometimes years in advance, and they are legally approved by the Israel Defense Force for the IDF to target. Now they go through lawyers, they go through a whole legal process to validate or adjudicate this target bank. Now, Israel will begin to fire on this target bank on a pretty aggressive basis, because their goal is to end the war as soon as possible. They're not doing it because they're trying to make pain. They're doing it because they want to defeat the military targets that they've identified so that they can go back to having a normal civilian life for the 9 million people of Israel. This, by the way, is protocol that you'll hear from any IDF senior officer. They will tell you this. I'm not giving you a state secret. Now, generally what happens when Israel starts to do this is Hamas starts to increase their rocket fire into Israel, except there's a big difference. Israel's rocket fire is precise. They use precision guided munitions to hit only the targets that they're looking for. With Hamas, it's a very different situation. They fire as many rockets as they can into population centers in the hope that they hit something, without knowing what that something might be. So it could be a school, it could be a hospital, it could be an apartment building, it could be a road, it could be a business, it could be a house. They don't care. This is by nature what happens when you fire unguided rockets into a populous area. Now, from there, it's interesting because what you begin to see, and we see this every time the conflict erupts, Israel begins to run out of targets for its target bank. And then Hamas begins to run out of the rockets that it wants to fire because Israel's either destroyed them or they've launched 5,000 of them into Israel, as it just happened in the last war. It's at that point when we begin to see other countries get involved to try to broker a ceasefire. And we've seen it in the past. It's the Egyptians, it's the United States, it's the Europeans. And it's only a matter of time before that ceasefire is brokered. Eventually, we reach a point of calm. The Israelis make certain offers to try to broker a longer-term ceasefire. Almost always Hamas rejects them. Israel can't ignore all of the rocket making and all of the weapons that Hamas is smuggling into the Gaza Strip. So they can't completely open up the Gaza Strip, but they do their best to try to alleviate the challenges that the people of Gaza have as they're being ruled by a terrorist organization. From there, the cycle begins again. Hamas accumulates more weapons. Israel identifies new targets for its target bank. And then at a certain point, Hamas begins to fire again. And it is a cycle. It happens over and over. This last war was the fourth major conflict, the fifth overall in the history of the Gaza-Israel wars. There will be, unfortunately, one after this and probably one after that. And we can imagine it going for a while. The only thing that it can be controlled is the way that it is described, the way that it is reported, the way that it is debated. because the facts are what they are each time. The cycle is always the same. The patterns are always the same. It's very rare that we see new things introduced into these wars. The important thing, in my view, and it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is for students and defenders of Israel, and in fact, defenders of truth, to at least be able to understand these basic characteristics of the war so that they can better describe what's going on and better combat disinformation.
And Jonathan, if you could talk to us a little bit about, one thing, a point I've heard you make and read in your work is sort of the different conflicts going on. There's the Hamas versus Fatah. There's at one point I remember reading, you said really there's sort of a Gaza-Israel conflict, and then Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, is sort of a separate thing altogether. Talk to us a little bit about that, and how are things holding now, a year after the latest round of fighting?
Sure. So look, the first thing is that this used to be the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's not anymore, right? We have seen a peace agreement with Jordan. We've seen a peace agreement with Egypt. And now we have this flurry of new agreements that we've seen coming out of the Persian Gulf and North Africa. So that means the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan and Morocco have all ceased their hostility toward Israel. So that means that we see a shrinking of the Arab-Israeli conflict as we know it. And it was the Arab-Israeli conflict that ultimately sparked the wars of 1948 and 56 and 67 and the Lebanon War in the 1980s. These were all things that we could point directly to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that's no longer what it was. It's not gone, but it is much smaller than it used to be. And that is an incredible achievement for Israel. And I think, by the way, it's a testament to the fact that Israel refused to go away. And they're proving to the Arab world that they're a force that must be reckoned with, and that peace is the only way forward, not destruction, not war. So while that's happened, and that's good news, we have another war that has erupted, and that is the Iranian Axis versus Israel. So when I say the Axis, it's not just Iran itself, but all of its allies and proxies. So that includes the Syrian government, the state of Syria, such as it is right now. It's barely a state today after a civil war, but the government is still aligned with Iran against Israel. And then on top of that, you've got Hezbollah, you've got Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and a number of other proxies that are armed and funded and trained by Iran. And their goal is the destruction of the state of Israel. They continue to destroy from inside the states that they inhabit, right? Iran itself is almost gutted from within, economically and politically. Iraq is another place where you see that presence. They've destroyed the state. It's barely functioning as it is. Lebanon is another place where the Iranian Axis has actually taken over. Hezbollah is by far the strongest actor in that country, and it is now $130, $140 billion in debt. It is going to collapse as a state, as we know it. And then, of course, you look at what's happening in Gaza. So you have these territories that Iran controls, and they're using them for a war against Israel. And that's the other kind of major conflict. That conflict is growing while the Arab-Israeli conflict is shrinking. And so that's an important dynamic to be aware of as we watch the Middle East. It's not even the Palestinian-Israeli conflict any longer, because as we know, the Palestinians are a house divided themselves. They've got a population center in the West Bank, and they've got one in the Gaza Strip. If you recall, during the last conflict, there was no fighting in the West Bank, where 2.5, 3 million people live, and they were not at war with Israel. It was only the one area, the Gaza Strip, that Iran has significant influence and control. So that's sort of a third conflict, and that's a Palestinian one, where they don't agree on leadership. They've been at war since 2007, and they've effectively evolved into two separate states, two Palestinian statelets. Let's call it West Bankistan and Gazastan. They don't even have the same governments any longer, and it's very hard to say that there is one Palestinian Authority. Now, there are a couple of other maybe factors to look at as we look at the friction in the region. There are two other states that contribute to this ongoing conflict with Israel that is led primarily by Iran. But these are two Islamist countries, Sunni countries, not Shia the way Iran is, and that is Turkey and Qatar. These are two sponsors of Hamas, and they've kind of joined hands with Iran, not as full-on allies, but they see Israel as a common enemy, and we can see them at work as well during these times of conflict between Israel and Hamas. But overall, I think it's important to note that the Arab-Israeli conflict, as it continues to dissipate, the focus really needs to be on who is funding, who is training, who is arming these militants in the Gaza Strip. Where is it all coming from? It is not organic. They don't have a lot of funding that is inherent to that area. They don't have the materials that they need. So they have to import weapons. They have to import rockets. They have to import the cement to create the tunnels that they use to try to attack Israel. That generally comes from one primary actor, and that's Iran. And then secondarily, we can look at Qatar and Turkey and maybe even Malaysia if you really want to dig deep. But this is now essentially a state-sponsored conflict. This is a proxy war against Israel by actors that really have no business fighting Israel. They're not on Israel's borders, right? They are far-flung, and they use Israel as a tool to whip up sentiment in their own countries and around the Muslim world. And I think that's lost on most people as they look at these conflicts. And again, I'll say that, supporters of Israel, those that I think want to be more clear-eyed and more forthright about their descriptions of these conflicts, often ignore the fact that this is a state-sponsored conflict. They don't want to, for some reason, they don't want to look at Iran. They don't want to look at Qatar or Turkey. What they do instead is they talk about how Israel has a right to bomb Gaza. That's really not where I think the argument needs to be. I think, by the way, that probably goes without saying that any country that's attacked by another, or any country that's attacked by someone who's firing rockets at them, they have a right to respond. But that's only the beginning. The question is, where are those rockets coming from? Where are the fighters coming from? How are they getting trained? How are they getting funded? Primarily, it tracks back to the greatest enemy the Middle East has seen in decades, and that is the Islamic Republic of Iran.
So, in other words, when we're told on campus or in the media that Hamas and the other Palestinian terrorist groups are somehow standing up for the little guy or standing up for the residents of Sheikh Jarrah, it's not quite true.
Well, no, and I think there's two things here. First of all, Hamas, when they say that they're standing up for the people of Gaza City, Hamas is utterly hated by the people of the Gaza Strip. I mean, there are about 2.5 million, maybe 3 million people that are in the Gaza Strip right now. They have been living in misery since Hamas took over by force in a war that nobody in Gaza wanted. This was back in 2007. And since then, the word that I've used is Talibanization, right? You see these laws, Islamic laws being enforced in this territory. That was otherwise a somewhat liberal place when it was a bit more free. I'm not going to say it was, a place where, the average Westerner would want to go on a Club Med vacation, but I would say that it's not anywhere today what it was like 30, 40 years ago, and even 50 years ago. I mean, this is a territory that has been taken over by an Islamist terrorist organization. And it shouldn't shock anybody on this call here that terrorist organizations are not particularly good at governance. They're not good at spreading funds to the people that need it the most. They're not good at building infrastructure. They're good at war. And I'm not even sure they're great at that, but they're good at waging war. They know how to start conflict, but they don't know how to end it. And this is, unfortunately, what's happening in the Gaza Strip. It's extremely difficult to say that it's a real stretch to say that they're standing up for the little guy in the Gaza Strip. The little guy in the Gaza Strip wants Hamas out, and they would like to have a better life. That's number one. Now, let's go to Sheikh Jarrah for a minute. Okay. This is one of the silliest stories that I have heard in years about the start of a conflict. Now, I have heard other silly stories. I was in graduate school in the year 2000. That makes me a dinosaur, by the way, probably according to most people on this call, but that's okay. So I'm in Israel when the second Intifada broke out, and at the time, the media was out there talking about how it was Ariel Sharon, the former defense minister, soon to be prime minister. The whole thing, the reason why the war started, why the Palestinians were carrying out suicide bombings in malls and in shopping centers and in restaurants and in dance clubs, the reason why that was all happening, and you can still find it on like Wikipedia, they will say that the cause of the second Intifada was Ariel Sharon walking on the Temple Mount. Now, let me just say, wars don't start because someone walked somewhere. Wars start because people start firing rockets and guns and exploding bombs. Now, fast forward to last year, you have a similar situation, right? You've got this real estate conflict in Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, just outside of the Damascus Gate. It's near the American Colony Hotel and the East Jerusalem consulate that the United States has traditionally operated. It's a small area, and it's part of Jerusalem, which Israel is the sovereign, right? There's really no disputing that. Now, what happened was the people started getting upset because it was possible that there were people who were living in homes that might be faced with eviction. Why might they be evicted by Israel? Well, it actually goes back about 100 years, 100-something years ago. Jews bought homes in East Jerusalem before the establishment of the state of Israel. Then Israel is established, and Jordan wages a war against Israel, and they capture East Jerusalem. What do they do when they capture East Jerusalem? They kick the inhabitants of these homes out. So that means that the Jews who bought these homes legally are evicted forcibly during a war. Israel recaptures this area in 1967 after the 1967 Six-Day War. And it is at that point that a legal dispute begins in Israel's very legitimate legal process, right? Israel's judiciary is not some sort of shill for the Zionist cause. This is a serious legal structure. And this real estate dispute goes on for decades. Now, at the time last year, it was possible, not even probable, that you could see the eviction of some of the Arab residents who would not recognize the rightful owners of those homes from a century ago. And that was, according to the media, why the war broke out. I'm sorry, real estate disputes do not cause wars. Guns cause wars. Rockets cause wars. And again, it's part of the very silly coverage. It's amazing. I mean, you think about the hundreds or even thousands of reporters that cover the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is probably one of the most covered conflicts in the history of mankind, okay? And yet we still have these incredibly simplistic explanations about why war breaks out. War breaks out because of an act of aggression, right? You couldn't blame, I mean, there are people who are out there trying to blame Ukraine because it almost joined NATO, that this is the reason why Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. But no, it was an act of violence that started this war, and that act of violence was perpetrated by Vladimir Putin. We have different standards to the way we look at wars, and somehow Israel is held to a worse standard than anyone else I've ever seen.
And Jonathan, it's the Sheikh Jarrah issue in particular, I think, speaks to the power of media, of social media. And our Hasbara fellows and college students know this better than anyone, that during the last war between Israel and Hamas, there was probably more than ever anti-Israel information propaganda online than ever before. My favorite term for it was the Instifada, where it was just a huge amount, and it came from influential voices like the famous Hadid sisters, who I think have 100 million followers on Instagram or so, and they sort of pushed this Sheikh Jarrah narrative, and it just shows the power of sort of what Israel is up against, and what all of us are up against.
It's true, and media is changing, and But I think the thing about social media is that it is instant, and it usually makes people prone to error. So if people are promoting false narratives, yes, a lot of damage can be done by disinformation that's put out by an account that's got a lot of followers. But we've also seen that when really egregious errors are made and they're pointed out, when facts show that things are different, you could lead to a lot of embarrassment of those that are pumping out that disinformation. There are ways of challenging them because everyone does have a voice on social media, right? It's sort of the great equalizer. It's no longer that the New York Times, when they run a piece, that's the, that is the gold standard, and everyone has to sort of agree with that one piece because it was written by America's newspaper of record. That's not how it works anymore. That, social media influencers, people who are on the ground, can report on what they see that can contradict news today. So I think there's a really interesting dynamic that's going on. I'll just, I'll note one more thing about this media environment. This was really one of the amazing moments for me, and I write about it in the book. But I think it was the third or fourth day of the conflict. I should read my book again to make sure. But there was that moment where, you may recall, the IDF announced on its Twitter feed that they were putting troops in the Gaza Strip, and they were fighting a ground war. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. That's midnight in Israel. I got to go check this out on TV. I don't believe that there's a ground war. I didn't think that Benjamin Netanyahu would actually do that. It just didn't seem like something that Bibi would do. So I go in and I turn on the Israeli television channel, Khan, channel 11. And I watch in Hebrew as a reporter is on camera saying, I can't confirm any of these reports. There are no troops streaming into the Gaza Strip right now. I think the IDF made a mistake, and I don't see a war. Nobody that I talked to at the Kiryat, the defense ministry, can confirm this. So I say, okay, well, I'm going to change the channel. I change it to channel 13. Same thing. Reporter says, I can't confirm this. This doesn't look like a story. Who did run that story? Almost every major American outlet. And they got egg in their face. They reported false information. Now, a lot of people blamed Israel and said that Israel was deliberately trying to obfuscate or, lead people down the wrong path. But one of the things that I've noted is that if you're able to watch TV or read in a foreign language, whether it's Arabic or Hebrew, or even Turkish or Farsi, you will find things that you will not find in the American media. The American media, gotta say, not strong, not steeped in this stuff, not deep on these issues. And so there are ways that people with a lone social media account can dispute facts faster and more effectively because they're tracking some of these other foreign media outlets. And I highly recommend it for anyone that knows Hebrew, that knows Arabic, and is able to follow these conflicts in a foreign language. It can be immensely helpful. And that was just one small example of where the American media really got it wrong and then got corrected pretty quickly.
Fascinating. So I'm going to ask you one more question and then open it up for Q&A. I'm seeing some activity in the chat and I'm seeing some hands up. And if you have a question, you can go ahead and type it in the chat if you like. You can also raise your hand if you just click participants, and then there's a little hand icon. And we actually have a couple questions emailed as well. So I think it'll be a busy Q&A period. So let me ask my last question here before opening it up. And I just wanted to go to Lebanon for a minute here, to Israel's border with Lebanon. And well, every time we're in Israel and every time we take a Hasbara delegation there, we go to the border with Lebanon, we go to the border with Syria. And essentially, any Hasbara fellow on the call could tell you sort of what we talk about and study up there is just, when you look at it from the perspective of our work on campuses, again, we're told it's Israel versus the Palestinians, and Israel's David or Goliath, and the Palestinians are David, and just a simple trip to Israel's north breaks that narrative. It's a reminder that Israel really is surrounded. And in the book, you talk about that there actually were rockets fired from Lebanon during Israel's last round of fighting with Hamas. And it's actually something, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in every round of Israel-Hamas fighting in Gaza, there's been some activity in the north. So Israel has to always watch all of its borders. And it's a dynamic that's sort of underappreciated.
It's absolutely true. And, what I think Israel is constantly concerned about is a multi-front war. They are not likely to see war from Jordan. Obviously, there's a peace agreement. They're not likely to see it from Egypt, but they have the Gaza Strip, and then they have Syria, where it's chaos right now because of the civil war, and Iran's trying to exploit that chaos. And then you have Hezbollah, which has a lowball estimate of 130,000 rockets facing Israel, and they're trying to develop precision-guided munitions so that they can hit Israel more effectively, not fire those blind rockets the way I talked about that Hamas does, but to fire more precise, more accurate missiles into Israel to try to hit their nuclear facility, to try to hit their chemical facility, to try to hit bases, to try to hit population centers. So the Israelis are constantly worried about that northern border, and it's even more chaotic now as Hezbollah grows in strength and the state begins to collapse. So there's a major problem there. The thing that I noted in the book, which for me was fascinating during that war, was, so there were 6 rockets that were fired last year during the war. There was one just the other night, by the way, in response, or maybe trying to add on to some of the chaos that we've been seeing in Israel over the last couple of weeks. But one of the things that dawned on me, I received a letter from a contact in Israel. It wasn't classified, it just wasn't widely published, but basically in 2017 and 2018, the Israelis warned the UN that Hamas was working to establish a military infrastructure in Lebanon so that they would be able to fire rockets in a future war between Hamas and Israel in the Gaza Strip, with the goal of having Israel respond to those rockets and draw Lebanon in to a second front. So in other words, what Hamas, with Iran's help, is trying to do is to create that 2-front war that Israel has been trying to prevent for a very long time. That will be something to watch in the future. I believe that that infrastructure probably exists. The only question is whether the Lebanese armed forces will try to remove it, whether Hezbollah sees that it will lead to a devastating war in the north. That's something that really that Lebanon can't afford. They're already $130 billion in debt, give or take, and then they have the destruction of a war with Israel. It is something I can't even imagine the suffering of the Lebanese people as a result of all of this. So it's something to watch, but it is part of that cynical strategy that I mentioned, where Iran is looking to hollow out the institutions of the states where it has that foothold. I mentioned Iran itself is already hollowed out. Iraq is very weak because of Iranian influence. Gaza is hollowed out, and Lebanon is hollowed out as well. This is the strategy. Iran wants to extend that influence across the Middle East. And I don't see a whole lot of people fighting against this on a political basis in terms of trying to expose it before it happens. And that's, I think, got to be very frustrating for the Israelis and really tough to watch for the rest of the Middle East.
Thank you, Jonathan. And we'll open it up for Q&A. Again, anyone who has a question, best way is just to go to click participants, and you should be able to raise your hand there. And also you can write it in the chat. So I see a number of hands up. We'll start with Ali, and then we'll come to you next, Toby, if you want to be ready with your mic. Ali Cohen, go ahead. If everyone could just introduce yourself, tell us which school, or if you're a community member, where you're from, and then just if you can introduce yourself and ask your questions. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Alan. So I'm Ali Cohen. I'm a Hasbara alum from Johns Hopkins University, living in New York City. And Jonathan, it's been a while since we've seen each other, but it's great to hear your current feedback and your current analysis of what's going on between Israel and Gaza. And, you've written extensively about the Abraham Accords, which is something I'd love for you to touch on, specifically how during this last conflict, Israel's peace partners were relatively quiet. And I'm curious to know if you think that this is a peace that will last or if this is temporary. And the second part of the question is that oftentimes Israel's adversaries on campus, like Students for Justice in Palestine and JVP, are more anti-Israel than Israel's Arab neighbors. So how do we communicate Israel's state of peace in the world as it pertains to the Abraham Accords?
Sure. Yeah, great to see you. Let me start by saying this, that no peace agreement is perfect. You're never going to see everything be 100% peachy all the time with peace partners, with allies. We see it between European allies in the United States. We see it between Israel and the United States. We see it between the United States and Canada, or the United States and Australia. And these are solid alliances. During the most recent conflict, there is no doubt that there were people in the Gulf who were beginning to wonder whether this was a good idea to make peace with Israel, as they saw pictures of, bombs landing in the Gaza Strip and destruction of Hamas infrastructure that looked, in some cases like Israel was bombing apartment buildings. In one case that was, where there was one tower that was destroyed that held a Hamas jamming infrastructure. They were trying to jam Iron Dome. And I actually, was watching some of the Arabic channels, and I was watching how it was covered, and people were upset. However, I will also say that it was interesting. These governments made a conscious decision this time to not run these images day in and day out the way that they used to. The way you still see on something like Al Jazeera, for example, they're running that stuff day in and day out. That's Qatari owned, and the Qataris are, of course, sponsors of Hamas, and so they're looking to whip up that sentiment wherever they can. We saw a much more muted response, and we also saw direct outreach by these Arab states to Israel, urging them to end the war quickly, letting them know what their concerns were. There was even a moment that I became aware of where the Israeli Twitter feed quoted the Quran in its justification of responding to Hamas. And, I heard from certain of Israel's Gulf partners and Arab partners, hey, this is offensive. You may be right in your reasoning for firing back on Hamas, but don't forget that this is not going to sit well among Muslims who are reading this Twitter feed. And so the Israelis took it down. And it was actually a moment where crisis passed. The thing that I would just say in general about this war was that when it was over, everything went back to normal. And when I say normal, I mean the good ties that exist between the UAE and Israel, between the Bahrain and Israel, between the Morocco and Israel. Not so much Sudan. Sudan's, I wouldn't even call it one of the Abraham Accord countries right now. It's going through its own problems. But even then, Sudan would not condemn Israel. And they said that we still stand by our peace agreement because we don't want war with anybody in the region. So it was the first major test of the Abraham Accords, and it passed with flying colors. It was very heartening to see that despite, or even because of some of these challenges, they were able to come together and have dialogue and to talk about what could be done next time to prevent some of the miscommunication and some of the tension that arose. But your second point is fascinating to me. I see it as well, that you see a lot of these organizations out there where their sole reason for being is to whip up sentiment against Israel, to try to drive hatred for Israel. And there is no doubt that that you have these groups that harbor more hate for Israel than a lot of Israel's Arab neighbors. There is no doubt about that. And I've actually heard that from diplomatic sources from the Arab world, that they're very confused about why campuses are more radical than they are as it relates to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And there is no answer for it right now, other than, in my opinion, to expose who these groups are. And one of the things that I did, this is, several years ago now, but we went and looked at a group called AMP, and they were one of the original groups that kind of spawned out SJP, the Students for Justice in Palestine. And it turns out that a lot of the people that helped create AMP had formerly worked for Hamas charities. Now, I'm not saying that they did anything wrong. I'm not saying they did anything that was illegal. I'm not saying they were funding Hamas. What I am saying is they made it very clear where they came from when they worked for some of these other organizations that were shut down by the US government because of their Hamas connections. We can't let people forget the roots of these organizations, that the reason for these organizations, really, it's malign stuff at the end of the day. These are hate groups, and there's nothing wrong with saying that, right? Israel is a sovereign nation that is trying to protect itself. It unfortunately is drawn into war time and time again. If these people don't want war, they should be condemning Iran. They should be condemning the actors that are providing the weapons to Hamas, and then Hamas fires them at Israel. Israel has no choice but to respond. Look, I know it's not simple. I know that the campus environment is a challenge, but the important thing is to learn the facts about who stands behind Hamas, who stands behind Hamas's supporters. You start to do that, and a pattern becomes a lot more clear. Hope that's helpful.
Very powerful.
Thanks so much.
Very powerful stuff. And I might just add, we focus so much at Hasbara on how we communicate. Images, stories are so important. And I might just draw to everyone's attention just this week, pictures going around of all the Arab ambassadors in Israel with an iftar meal. That's the breaking of the Ramadan nightly fast. All Arab ambassadors in Israel, hosted by Benny Gantz, the defense minister of Israel. And I think a pretty powerful image that's going around online right now. And unfortunately, we don't quite see that with Students for Justice in Palestine and their allies on campuses, but an important thing, I think, to spread. We'll go to Toby, and then I see Sadie's hand as well, and then Jonathan, coming to you after that. So, which I see you're in the chat. If you want to, if you want to ask one of your questions, just raise your hand. Otherwise, I'll pick one of your 3 questions in the chat there. So, go ahead, Toby, if you want to introduce yourself, please. And we are down to just 3 final questions here. So, if we could go, Jonathan, rapid fire style, because I also have 10 unasked questions here too, which I don't think we'll have time for. But
okay,
so go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Hi, my name is Toby. I'm a Hasbara alum from 2019, I believe. I went to Vanderbilt where I was when I was on Hasbara, and now I'm a student at Georgetown Law. I'm not sure how much you know about what's happening at Georgetown right now, but literally as I speak, Mohammed Al-Kurd is on our campus talking about Sheikh Jarrah. And we did a lot of engagement with administration to kind of be really clear about the fact that this was anti-discrimination and the free speech policy shouldn't prevent it. It led to meetings with the deans and lots of other kind of conversations in which we were told that we were listened to and heard, except no action was taken besides additional security. I'm wondering if you have any tips on engaging with administration on the urgency of the matter, particularly given the kind of game theory ideas. And I just want to note that the AMP that you mentioned is one of the sponsors of the event today with Al-Kurd. So I just want to know the administrative engagement techniques.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not at the end of the day, I'm not a campus activist, so I can't tell you where I'm, where I've had success or failures, because I haven't had any. What I can say though is Georgetown's an interesting case, and I think there is some work to be done there. And the reason is this: Georgetown has a campus in Doha, in Qatar. And Qatar has what's known as Education City. There's, I think, 5 or 6 schools that have campuses there. Georgetown is one of them. This means that Georgetown takes quite a bit of money from the Qataris for their brand. And it also means that Georgetown is taking money from an organization that sponsors Hamas. And that, by the way, has also sheltered Al-Qaeda. It has been a sponsor of the Taliban. It is a sponsor of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a hate group by pretty much any measure. And so my advice is, look, someone like Mohammed Al-Kurd will come on a campus in the name of free speech, and I've seen it across the country. He's on a world tour. It's what he's doing. The question is, what can you do to push back and to make the administration think again about this? And I believe that the Education City campus is probably its weakest link. I really do. So my suggestion, and I'm happy to provide information on this campus, I find it shocking that any university, especially one of the stature of Georgetown, would be willing to take money from a country like Qatar. This is a country that's engaged in human rights abuses, that bribed its way to buying the World Cup. This is unbelievable that Georgetown would continue this relationship. So happy to help if I can on that. There's lots of information, all open source. None of this is new.
Thank you, Jonathan. And Toby, if you haven't been in touch with the Hasbara Fellowship staff person about it since Mohammed, since the speaker was announced on your campus, just please do send us an email. And let's go to Sadie. Sadie, if you want to introduce yourself, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, my name. Oh, I don't know. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
My name is Sadie Hope. I'm the current Hasbara Fellow at Grosse City College, and I'm also the Director of Education at the New Zionist Congress. So I have a question about Israel pivoting to a virtual sphere for like the next war, and if you think that young Israelis will be able to help the Israeli government and just average Israelis turn to that front before the next war starts, or do you think it'll be far too late and that we'll already like lost the war before it begins because we are unfamiliar with like fighting a war online?
It's an interesting question. Look, in the virtual sphere, we already know that the Israelis are fighting with artificial intelligence tools to help them identify targets that they wouldn't otherwise be able to identify. They're also, by the way, using AI to help identify whether there are civilians in certain locations so that they can not target them. So there is a whole realm through, I believe it's all done through Unit 8200, which is their cyber unit. And it's more and more integrated into regular IDF operations. What has been missing is exactly what you described, which is that, battle of ideas that should be taking place in the cyber realm. The problem is, and we're talking primarily social media. The problem is that I don't believe that the IDF takes that fight as seriously as perhaps they take other fronts. And I think we see this on a consistent basis. There's just always kind of a mess that you find that is awaiting everyone after these wars, where there's just a huge amount of trying to explain in retrospect what happened. And there needs to be more. Look, it's one of the reasons why I wrote that book, primarily because I saw a lot of disinformation. I saw a lot of false narratives. This is, by the way, not to say that Israel's perfect. This is not to say that Israel always fights a clean war and that everything's perfect. There are things that Israel has done that I've disagreed with on the battlefield. But I do think that for folks to understand how these wars usually work, who the sponsors are of the terrorist groups that attack Israel, what they're trying to do, how things generally evolve, this was the point of writing the book. And I can only stress so much that I think it's important in preparation for the next war to have that information at your fingertips, so that, and by the way, to also follow the right people and to echo the right people and to stop engaging in, well, they deserved it and that's why Israel's fighting back, but to say, okay, let's dig a little deeper. Let's look at what's going on behind the scenes. And there, it's about following the right people and having that knowledge already in your brain. So that's for the next front.
Thank you. And we'll have, I'll just kind of summarize a couple of questions here in the chat in the couple of minutes we have remaining here. And Jonathan Franklin, Jonathan, good to see you. You asked, is the UN General Assembly and UNRWA do they still help fuel the conflict in your view, Dr. Schanzer? They still factor? Yeah,
100%. And actually, if you look at what happened after the war, it was amazing, actually. UNRWA came out and actually reported that there were tunnels that were being dug underneath some of its facilities, and they were angry about Hamas and they were trying to distance themselves. So that was like sort of on the positive side of the ledger. On the negative side, the guy that raised this and raised some of the other concerns was actually ejected from the Gaza Strip, and the funding is continued. And while the funding is continued, it continues to perpetuate a narrative that there are, in fact, millions of Palestinian refugees. In reality, there were 600,000 to 800,000 of them back in 1948. There's no way that there are 6 to 8 million of them now, because people get old and they die, unfortunately. And so the real number is probably somewhere between, I don't know, 30 to 100,000 of surviving refugees, not the 6 to 8 million that UNRWA claims to be on the registry. So they continue to foster a narrative that perpetuates the conflict, even as some of their people have started to point out some of the problems associated with Hamas and the Gaza Strip.
And I'll ask one last question from the chat, which is, do you see any possible way for the fighting between Hamas and Israel to end?
Yeah, I do. And you look, I'll tell you how it starts. It starts by sanctioning Iran and making sure that they don't have excess cash that they can throw off to terrorist organizations. So a great way to start down that road is to not enter into the Iran nuclear deal that's currently being considered by this administration, that would give them somewhere between, I don't know, 100 and 170 billion dollars in sanctions relief and cash. You do that, and it's a surefire way to arm up Iran for the next, to arm up Hamas for the next conflict. But even beyond that, what you want to do is you want to try to deprive Iran of those funds. We need to make sure that Iran's not able to bring Hamas fighters to the country for training or to other locations for training. We need to do better internationally at interdicting the weapons that are being smuggled into the Gaza Strip. That needs to be taken more seriously. These are things that can be done. And by the way, I would also note, and this gets back to the question for Georgetown, you know, the idea that Qatar can get away with being a donor to universities while also being a funder for Hamas, that has to stop, right? If they begin to feel that there are repercussions for the kinds of policies that they've embraced, well, then maybe they'll stop doing one and only do the other. I take money to Georgetown over money to Hamas any day of the week. I'd prefer not either with the current regime that we're talking about, but I can imagine that there could be a binary choice that's put to the Qataris in light of their track record. So there are ways to pressure the Qataris, the Turks, certainly the Iranians. And if you could make sure that there are fewer weapons and there's less cash that flows into the Gaza Strip, there are fewer people that are being allowed to train outside by Iranians, that's how you see Hamas be much more fearful of entering into the next conflict. And that's ultimately what leads to hopefully a dialogue that's brokered by the Egyptians or maybe the Emiratis or whoever are trying to bring about a more peaceful solution to the Middle East. That's how this should work, but it has to start with cutting off the flow of funds to the bad actors that are literally stoking the fires of the Gaza Strip from afar. That's what needs to stop first. It's what needs to stop now.
So important. Jonathan, thank you for joining us. I want to thank everyone who's on the call for joining us, and especially thank the students who are with us here on Zoom or those who are streaming on social media. Thank you all for everything you do on your campuses, and thank you for joining us. Next month, we do not have a leadership session planned because we will be in Israel. First Hasbara Fellowship's mission of the summer to Israel, May 15th. And we are, for all the students on the call, we have still space remaining for August, not for the one leaving in 3 weeks, but in August, we have still a couple of spots if you have fellow leaders on your campus who want to come to Israel with Hasbara, and applications will be up soon for December as well. So please tell your peers on your campuses. And Jonathan, thank you. Thank you again for educating us and for joining us. And to everyone, we'll see you over the summer on our next leadership session, which you'll hear the announcement over email soon. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It was really nice to meet you.
Great to meet you guys.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you, Jonathan, as well.
Thank
My
you.
other Jonathan.